Hi, this is Anneliese Antoinette. This is the first in a series of videos where I'm interviewing people in short bursts about something that they are excited about, passionate about, and or knowledgeable about. So today I have Alexander Eth with me of Glitch Bottle. Glitch Bottle is a podcast that Alex has been running for about 3 years now, and he's been doing videos for 5 years, and he was in radio broadcasting for 10 years before that. So Alex immediately, of course, came to mind when I got the idea to interview someone, but it's actually about how to interview someone. So Alex, I'm so happy to have you here. Thank you for being here.
Annalise, it is a real pleasure to be with you. I'm incredibly honored that you would even think to chat. So the honor's mine. Happy to be here.
Thank you so much. Well, when people think of high quality podcasts, you immediately come to mind. You set the guest at ease, you ask super intelligent questions, you're always prepared, and it's super professional. So I would love to learn from you some quick tips on how to conduct a really super positive interview where the guest feels good and the audience leaves feeling, really happy with how they spent their time watching it.
That's a really good question, Annalise. So one of the things that I always try and keep in mind with a guest is they're an expert or they're passionate about something. They really want to share something, whether it's a new book or a magical practice or an esoteric practice or mysticism, or they're a scholar and they've just, come out with a brand new book or anything like that. So the one thing that I try and do is I always try and make the guest feel comfortable by keeping things at a very kind of conversational level. And one of the ways that I do that is I actually start out most interviews with a kind of a wide-ranging question, an open-ended question, if you will. So one of the things that I try and avoid in interviews is if I'm going to ask a yes or no question, chances are it's a really easy thing to do, but sometimes the guest, especially if it's their first time recording a podcast, they might say, "Oh, I don't want to necessarily do that." So they might say, "Oh, yes," or "No," and that kind of shuts down the conversation. So what I do is I say, "Hey, how did this whole thing start? How did your early background start? What was the genesis of this book? How the heck did you get interested in this subject? Because so many people might not be interested in that." So one of the things I try and do is just keep it very open-ended, but also conversational too.
Okay. And do you check in advance with what the guest is comfortable talking about and what they would prefer to avoid? Because I know some podcasters and some interviewers have a sense of gotcha, and I know you try to avoid that.
Yeah, Annalise, that's something I would never want to ever do. And yeah, I always make sure to check with the guests beforehand because my number one rule is like I'm so honored and fortunate that a guest or a scholar, a ceremonial magician, an esotericist, a mystic, whoever they are, that they're stopping by and taking time out of their day in order to just share about what they're passionate about. So yes, I basically will always reach out in advance, and even before the interview starts, even before we hit record, just kind of say and reiterate like, "Hey, we will always talk about things that you want to talk about. There's no gotcha questions. If you're answering something and you maybe want to start it over, or if maybe you want to jump to a different subject, no problem." Like, I think for myself and the listeners, like, we're just fortunate that you're taking the time to chat. So yes, there's definitely no gotcha in any of the interviews.
So, something else I also noticed that you do is you allow each guest to finish their thoughts. And I know I appreciate that about your podcast, and I know other folks notice it as well. So, what I would love to learn from you also, though, is how you keep the conversation flowing and organic without interrupting the person. Because I know I find myself when I'm speaking with friends, I'll maybe make them pause at something that inspires a memory in me or something I can relate to or a tangent that I would love them to expand on. And somehow you remember that. Do you remember that like just in your head? Are you writing it down? Or how do you keep it flowing organically without interrupting them?
Wow, that's a really good question. So for me, there's a couple things that I do. The first is when I have a guest and we're chatting and they're answering a question, but then they might say something that's totally like, wow, I never even thought of that. I'd love to explore that. For me, when I do an interview, I always have next to me a notepad, like just a plain legal pad with a pen, and I just write things down. And if they say something like you were saying with a tangent or something that you really want to go to later, as the guest is answering, I usually jot down maybe two or three words to kind of remind me, oh, yeah, they said this. But in addition to that, and to your point, I usually will never like interrupt a guest midstream because I usually find that when a guest is answering a question, a lot of times they'll start with their initial answer. And if they think of something else, they'll kind of weave that into the answer that they're already saying. So to me, it's kind of like watching a tapestry unfold. Like I'm just going to let the guest kind of answer it. And then once they're done, I'll definitely make sure to go back. And if I have another question that was kind of pre-prepared, I might go into that. Or like you were saying, if they say, oh my gosh, like this whole tangent thing that's amazing, I might glance at my notepad, look at those three key words, and just say, hey, you mentioned this about a minute ago. Can you elaborate on that? And that usually keeps it flowing and in kind of a new and interesting way, but without detracting from kind of the flow. It doesn't truncate anything and make it kind of awkward. So
Okay, perfect. And then how do you deal with timing and pacing?
timing and pacing. Yeah, that's a really interesting question because when it comes to timing, really, I've had podcasts where it might be an hour long. I've had podcasts where, it's been 3 or 4 hours long. So I really kind of keep it very loose in terms of time.
Mhm.
However much time the guest has, that's how much time I would want to put into the interview. So for me, if I have, say, an infinite amount of time, for me it's all about going into those issues and taking as much time as possible, and if needed, I'll actually break it up perhaps into like multiple podcasts. So sometimes I've had guests where part one is 2 hours and part three or part two is 2 hours, etc. So like for me it's all about just giving the guests room to breathe. Like they're the expert, we're all really fortunate that they're taking the time, and so just giving them time to expand on those ideas. I find like it's the things that they expand on sometimes that weren't even planned, that sometimes you'll get feedback from listeners saying, oh, I thought it was so cool that so and so talked about this, and like you're like, yeah, I never, that was never even part of the original conversation. So it really is about just finding that balance and just making sure that you're never cutting the guest off, giving them time to expand, and then just kind of adjusting as you go from there, maybe doing multiple episodes.
Excellent, thank you. And one more thing, you taught me a particular technique that relates to video versus audio. Can you share a bit about that, please?
Absolutely, Anneliese. So I come from the world of radio. So I am used to being very like huddled over a microphone and just not even looking like this and not making eye contact. And so one of the things that I know there's, so many great podcasters out there, in the esoteric world and otherwise who do video. So for me, one of the things that I kind of had to train myself on a little bit is making sure to keep my eye contact on the actual video camera like I am now, because as a radio guy, like I can see your face below the camera, so I want to like stare here and be like, hello, Anneliese. But I really have to kind of force myself to, and after a while it just becomes kind of second nature. But just reminding people that looking directly in the camera is definitely the best way to go, because it has that kind of two-way conversation going on. So yeah, that's something I definitely had to get used to. But I am glad that I did. So slowly, this radio guy is getting used to doing the video stuff.
Well, I definitely noticed that you do that. You do that on Zoom calls, you do that on video interviews, and I always appreciate that because it feels like more of a connection with the viewer. And when I first learned, you did that and you taught me how to do that. It definitely did not feel very comfortable at all because I like to make eye contact and I feel like I get a better heart connection with someone when I'm actually looking at their face and in their eyes. And then later on video, I'm not actually looking at them. It's like I'm looking like this or something.
Yeah.
But anyway, and then finally, for the last question, how do you recommend wrapping up an interview when it's time to say goodbye?
Uh, that is a that is a really good question. So I always will ask the guest two things. The first is, where can people find you if it's on, Facebook or their website, or if they have a book or kind of a magical blog or whatever it is, just kind of have the guest say that. And honestly, one of the last things that I try and ask guests, if it comes up, is just, is there anything else that we haven't talked about that you want to talk about? So for me, it just is kind of a question where if a guest in the back of their head is like, oh, I really wish that they asked me about this, that you kind of give them that space so they can talk about it. So I would say those are kind of the two main things that I try to do.
Okay, so in following your very excellent example, I'm going to do that. Alex, is there anything that we have not covered that you wish we had talked about or you feel is like a super important tip for interviews?
No, Anneliese. The only thing I can say is I think what you're doing by having these kind of short conversations with different guests, I think it's awesome because I think it's something that you don't really see too much, and yet it's really really cool. So like I am so thankful for your expertise. I'm really thankful for your interest. Like it's just a huge honor. So thank you so much.
Oh, well, honestly, the honor's all mine. I'm so grateful you agreed to do this. And how can listeners or viewers find you, Alex?
Oh, listeners, anytime you can check out Glitch Bottle, it's youtube.com/glitchbottle. Glitch Bottle's on Apple Podcasts, it's on Spotify, Spreaker.com, Stitcher Radio. And if you would like to support the Glitch Bottle, if you'd like to support the podcast, if you go to Patreon, patreon.com/glitchbottle, you can help keep literally the lights on as my laptop screen just went dark there. You can literally help keep the lights on for Glitch Bottle. It helps pay for a lot of the monthly expenses to keep the podcast going. And of course, there's some kind of like exclusive content. If you're interested, you can check that out with guests and videos and things like that. So yeah, Patreon is always great for sure.
Alex, this has been absolutely wonderful. I really appreciate your time, your wisdom, your energy, and thank you so much for this. And because my goal for this is to not have to edit anything, I'm just going to hit stop recording. So have a wonderful day and thank you so much.
You too, Annalise. Thank you.